Christianity and a bunch of other things. And I did go back through it and took some notes and stuff. I want to, I guess, start off with the determinism, Calvinism stuff, because I find that fascinating. And I'm very conflicted, right? Like, there's a lot of good arguments for the deterministic nature of the universe, and by extension, the absence of free will. And I find them compelling, for sure. I can't shake the intuition that is not the case, but then again, that intuition is shaped by the evolutionary processes and determinism that we're talking about, right? Then you get into quantum mechanics and arguments about the randomness that there is there, the uncertainty and all that, and it kind of keeps the idea that there could be something like non-determinism, or what? I mean, maybe you know the other term that they use besides non-determinism, but something else that could be the case. I understand that that's also there in the quantum mechanics arguments, but I'm not a quantum expert by any means. I don't know if you know more about it than I do. You probably do. You're a computer scientist, so I'll let you talk about that. But I just wanted to say that I'm a little conflicted there, and I'm very excited to get into this with you again. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, for most Christians, it's quite unpalatable because from the religious point of view, people like to think of God, the God of the Bible, or at least the one that's a good sales pitch is, the teddy bear who really wanted everyone to do well and wanted everybody to come to him. And it was a shock and a surprise to him that some people decided to reject him, and that he never meant for this to happen. So obviously for Christians as well, it's unpalatable to consider the God of the Bible as a deterministic, sovereign simulator, and you are basically dancing to the drum of his beat. People don't like that. They say it's not fair. I mean, and there's all sorts of arguments around there, but like, what is fair? Define what is fair. What would be the alternative that is fair? I can't think of any. In terms of the universe and what we know so far about deterministic nature of it, even with quantum mechanics, it's not as if the uncertainty is completely random. It's just that you can't find the exact causal source. So right now, some of the most successful hypothesis for quantum mechanics is that we actually live in an 8-dimensional space, and the 3 dimensions are detectable to us. But those 8-dimensional spaces do move through our plane, our 3D plane, and that's what gives you what seems random, but it's actually a perfectly calculable thing in an 8-dimensional space. But even that wasn't so. I mean, even it was like literally a random generator, you as an agent inside the simulation aren't responsible for that. So it doesn't actually help the concept of free will to say, well, there is a random generator somewhere in the universe. You're not controlling that random generator, so it doesn't bring the free will argument any further.
Well, it's interesting, right? Oh, you okay? Bless you.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea that there is no free will and that there is no objectivity to like things like morality, that this is a deterministic reality, is not just a Calvinist, your perspective. There are a lot of atheists and secular people that have similar notions, right? It's interesting that I think about that concept.
Yeah. It surprised me coming into Christianity, realizing that biblically that was the teaching. Although most Christians don't read the Bible. They go to church, it's a social club. They would be shocked to know, how far their theology deviates from what's written in the Bible. Normally, Christianity is just whatever the contemporary culture is at the time, with a sprinkling of a few things they like from the text. But coming in, before I'd even arrived at a church, just reading the raw biblical texts, I was very surprised how congruent it was with everything. Like I said, when I converted to Christianity, coming out of my 7th year at university, I mean, by the time I left university, I had 2 master's degrees, computer science, I'd done wave theory. I'd lectured Freud analysis for 2 years. So my mind was primed, for scientific thinking. and then converting to Christianity and then finally reading the Bible, I was very surprised to see how rational and what do we call it, ideologically consistent. That was a surprise to me. Yeah. And then, of course, when you come with that perspective into the church, you'll upset a lot of people because they haven't actually read the Bible. Oh, I just lost volume. You still
Up with that now. Yeah.
You're back.
Okay.
You're back.
Okay. Sorry about that. So yeah, there are secular atheists, and they believe also that there is no free will, that it is a deterministic reality. And to me, that seems to imply, if there is no objectivity as far as this goes, that the moral objectivity doesn't exist, and then we don't have free will, we don't have choice, then really when we use words like right, wrong, better, worse, etc., those words are totally vacuous. They don't mean anything, right? That brings me to the conclusion that we might as well just choose any random ideology and stick with it. As long as it doesn't result in all our extinction, it doesn't matter whether or not we like it or not, whether it's true or not. There is no truth, right? It's just what it is. So why not just all pick Christianity? Why not all just pick Islam, whatever? Just pick it and stick with it. It doesn't matter, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if it was deterministic with no sentient source, then it wouldn't matter. Like, whether, if, for example, the universe's singularity expansion one day could be explained by naturalistic means, and we realized that there was no need for intent, because right now we have this dichotomy of looking at the dimensionless constants of our universe, especially things like the cosmological constants, which are like tuned to the power of 10 to the minus 122, that allows the universe to expand at the exact right speed for hydrogen and helium to coalesce into stars, and the stars is what produces chemistry, organic chemistry, and then life. And these things are on insane knife edges, and the only answer we have to this incredible precision at the moment is multiverse, megaverse theory. But then, of course, the other side of the dichotomy is intent. Some sort of God, some sort of intentional first mover behind the universe. So if it's the former, then it doesn't matter. Then, as Paul says, I think in Corinthians, for if Christ is not risen, let's just eat and drink. And like, who gives a shit? Like, that's basically what he says. So he also understands that dichotomy. So
can I ask you a question? Why does the precision aspect, the precise answers to these constants and variables of the universe, how does that indicate intelligence by any means? To me, it seems that that seems to indicate mathematics. Like, it's just a function. Whatever it is, whatever the underlying inputs are to whatever it is that results in a universal expansion, is just a mathematical function, which does not need an intelligence to create it, right? Like, no human created any of the mathematical discoveries that we've made, right? Those aren't inventions so much as they are discoveries. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, we've discovered, mathematics is just building models to try and predict what's already baked into the cake in terms of the maths of the universe, so to speak. But the reason we would say it's fine-tuned is because whenever you have a insanely low probability outcome manifest, in any situation, there can only be two reasons for it. It's a true dichotomy. The one is significant opportunity to explain the statistical improbability manifesting, and the other one is intent. So if you walk into any crime scene and you see, I always like the example of the gambler's fallacy. So if you're in a casino and you are the slot machines and you're pulling all night and you're losing, and then you say to yourself, man, I've been losing all night, I better just play a bit longer because surely I'm going to win. you think my luck couldn't be this bad for much longer. That's called the gambler's fallacy. And the inverse gambler's fallacy is if you were to walk into a casino and then see like 10 people hit the jackpot at the same time, and then you would say, oh, they must have been here all night. So both of those thinkings are fallacies. They're statistically wrong. It doesn't work like that. So that's why intent is such a great option, because the opportunity option, you got intent and significant opportunity. Significant opportunity without evidence is the inverse gambler's fallacy. So if you only have evidence for one universe and you see it manifest ridiculously small odds, then intent is the most likely answer. And it's not like it's a function, because, for example, with the cosmological constant, it's actually a ratio. It's the ratio of dark energy in a vacuum. So in a ratio is just one proportion over another. It could be anything, but it's exactly what it needs to be for a stable 14 billion year expansion that bears stars and life. And that's just one of like dozens of these constants, which is just perfectly primed. Now, how do you explain
That's what I mean. Like, if it is exactly what it needs to be for this to be the case, then it seems to me that if it were anything else, this wouldn't be, right?
Yeah, and it's not like it would be. A lot of people will use the argument and say, "Oh, yeah, well, if the universe was slightly different, then it would be slightly different," And then we'd be like, "Oh, wow, survivor bias," Look how.
I mean, that just seems to imply that this is what is necessarily the mathematical construction of a functioning reality.
Yeah, but the issue is this is the only way it can work. It's not like if you were to tweak the cosmological constant, you could have, if the cosmological constant was slightly smaller, like, we're talking like 10 to the minus 123 kind of change. You'd either have a universe that expanded too quickly for the helium and hydrogen to coalesce into stars, or it would have imploded already under its own weight before where we are now, which is like 14 billion years down the road.
Well, that's like if you mess with one slider on the, like, you ever mess with sound, like sound engineering at all? A little bit.
Yeah.
So you mess with one slider, right, and it changes it significantly, right? But if you move one or two of them in opposite directions, or maybe in the same direction, depends on what effect you're trying to get, right? But you move them in different ways to get the same kind of effect, or at least close enough to your ear that you want it to be. So like, if we change the cosmological constant of expansions, what was the one you just mentioned? I'm sorry, the constant you just mentioned. Can you remind me?
The cosmological constant, lambda. It's basically the ratio of dark energy in a vacuum.
Okay, so if we change that one, and we change perhaps maybe the intensity of electromagnetic fields, to throw something out there, right? Some other aspect of the universe that we could also change on that slider, right? Then maybe it would all coalesce similarly, right?
Well, it's the opposite happens, because it's just like your sound desk analogy. If you got one dial, and just to give you an example of how big 10 to the 122 is, there's only about 10 to the 90 atoms in the visible universe. So you're talking about a ratio that's smaller than the number of atoms in the visible universe. Right, so this dial is, 30 light years wide, and there's like dozens of them. Now, if you were to randomly like get drunk and just fall into your studio and like smash a desk with like one dial, okay, there's a certain probability that you'll get the sound right. But if you fall on like 10 dials, it doesn't make it more likely that the sound's going to get better. It's more likely it's going to get worse, because there's more range in 10 dials than there are in one dial. So it's not like the one dial can compensate for the other. It's not like there's a higher probability of landing on a stable expansion with more dials. It actually gets less.
I mean, that brings me the question of like, what is the inputs that result in existence? Like, how does existogenesis work, right? If there is any such thing, but that question applies to God as well. Like, whatever is reality, if it exists at all in any kind of, if you can use the word exists to describe it, then it exists. So if there is a God, if a God exists, then it is a a thing that exists in reality. So what is the nature of that? How does that happen? Why does a God happen at all? Why is infinity a thing? We're just kicking the can down the road further, I think.
Yeah. Space-time is like a fascinating thing. So our universe expanded with time at the same time. So it's like a literal continuum. So you got space-time, because you can't have time without space, because you wouldn't have anything through time, and you can't have none of those things work independently. So as the universe expanded, time expanded with it. So there was no time before. So whatever was the origin, the causal source of our space-time, had to be outside of our space-time. And that's not a strange concept at all, because one of my favorite examples is if you you took a toy bunny and you threw it towards a black hole, and you had a telescope and you could watch the bunny go to the black hole. As that bunny traveled towards the event horizon, the horizon of events on the edge of the black hole, you would see the bunny slowing down more and more as it got to the edge of the event horizon. And then it would just sit there forever in your timeline, forever.
Mm-hmm.
From the bunny's perspective, the bunny just went straight across the event horizon. There was no change in speed, nothing. Okay. Now, when that bunny crosses that event horizon, it literally does not exist in your reality. It is in another timeline now, because your timeline and that bunny's timeline have ceased to overlap. That's why you see it on the edge of the event horizon for eternity, even though it went straight through, not even realizing it was crossing event horizon. So, if an inanimate object can, if we can witness an inanimate object literally leave our timeline, gives you an idea of, how unbound something like a prime mover, like a god, would be from time. Just like when you create a simulation, or like the Sims game, when you pause the game, or you go to bed at night, or you reboot it, or you're not bound to the reality of the simulation that you created or that you're playing.
Right. So that seems to me to indicate that there's some kind of baseline reality, right? There's something that our apparent reality springs from or emerges, right?
Yeah. A causal source. And what timeline?
Yeah, you would call that God.
Yeah. What that timeline looks like, who knows? I like the way, I always say those goat herders always had these profound ways of considering these things. When, if you believe the story, when Abraham is sitting there and God decides to reveal himself to man, Abraham hears this voice and he says, who's there? And then he says, I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. To me, a day is like 1,000 years, 1,000 years is like a day. All time stands before me. This is stuff written from the oral tradition 5,000 years ago. That is just insane for some goat herder to suddenly start talking about this prime mover who's outside of space-time. It's a couple of crazy things like that.
It is interesting from a philosophical perspective. I wouldn't give that any kind of evidentiary power personally.
Yeah, it's just profound it's profound for some dude sitting in the Levant, milking goats in the desert with no education, to just suddenly.
Yeah, certainly.
Hey.
I would say that's probably an indication of why Christianity achieved the popularity that it has as being the most popular religion on the planet right now, because it involves a deeper philosophical exploration of reality than other competing ideologies at the time.
Yeah, I actually learned something interesting the other day. Zoroastrianism. Have you heard of Zoroastrianism?
I've heard of it. I have not studied it.
So apparently it's the oldest religion, even some argue even older than some of the earliest Hindu religions, making it pretty much the earliest thing we have. And they were considered the wise men. So they were the scientists of their day, and they studied the stars and tried to work out timing and build navigation maps and things. And they were called the Magi. That was the name they went by. And it's very interesting that at the birth of Christ, remember, it's the three Magi that visit him. They were actually Zoroastrians that came to visit. Right. And I found that very interesting. They were they were from the proto-religion of all religions.
How do you explain that in your mind? What is your hypothesis?
I think that even obviously Christianity comes from Judaism, but I think Judaism stretches way back into Zoroastrianism. I think there's a
Right.
long line of revelation going all the way back to these proto-scientists who used to build the star maps.
Interesting. Yeah,
It's not,
I look at the we spoke about it a little bit in our last conversation. The fact that Cain, I believe it was, left Adam and Eve and went and took a wife in another place, right? And so that seems to me to indicate that the people of the Bible are breaking away from another people. I think even in that, in the time of these legends being created, that's evident in the storytelling that this is just a offshoot of human beings that are finding themselves to be the originators of a new way of thinking, and so they call themselves, like, the way that they write, it seems to indicate that we seem to interpret it as they're being created anew, right? That's our interpretation, like they're brand new, Adam and Eve, the new human beings, but they're just a new people, perhaps.
Yeah, and the Bible's got quite a narrow scope if you think about it. Like, the entire story is about one little shitty backwater tribe from the Levant who were like by no means special. They were like basically a slave tribe, and somehow they just started this ideology that just consumed the whole world, and till today.
No, I mean, when you're in a position of being oppressed, then your reflection on the moral reality of your life can be, would be profound, right? It seems to be indicated by that. If you are going to be oppressed, then you're going to think about why you're being oppressed and how this even happens to you a lot, you know?
Yeah, you can be more reflective. Yeah. I mean, the biblical narrative is that God deliberately chose the most shitty backwater tribe he could to prove a point. Again, how sovereign he was. Because if he had picked somebody that was more honorable or notable, it would have been less of a thing, you know. He seems to love irony. Like, if you read all the biblical stories, like all the time, he just picks the worst guy. You know, you go from Samson to David to Solomon, like all of them. Like, they're like the unwilling hero. You know, the story of Jonah, like all these stories, just constantly. You know, God could have picked a whole bunch of great guys to do stuff, and he always picks the worst. You know, that's like this ironic theme of the entire Bible.
We got into this the last time, but the idea that this is a deterministic universe, right? Now, I have not settled my mind as far as the secular thinking on this, so I'm conflicted on even discussing it, because it's hard to point out the inconsistencies of another ideology when I'm not even sure that I don't hold those inconsistencies myself as well. So I do want to get into it a little bit, because I think it's important. The idea that there's no free will, that God is telling us that it has made us as he wishes us to be, and there's nothing we can do about it, or the universe has created us as we have to be. There's nothing we can do about that. And either way it goes, the inconsistency is with our observation of ourselves. We can't observe ourselves in that way consistently. And that could be a function of evolution, but it could also be the intention of God, whatever it is.
Yeah,
either way, we need to figure this out.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult for an agent who's living in space-time to look at reality in the same way someone does from outside of space-time. So, for example, we've got deep AI now, right? We've got these neural networks that have hundreds of millions of neurons, you know, weighted neural networks. And then we're creating this artificial intelligence. You know, it's a big thing now, because we're basically teaching computers to learn the way humans learn, which allows it to go beyond what we could normally program it to by traditional methods. Now, say for example, we created a super AI with a trillion neuron network. So in a way, it would be more conscious than us. You know, if you believe consciousness is just, you know, a certain level of neural complexity, and then you put it into a simulation, and then you watched it make choices. Now, are those choices free? You know, you program the neural network, you put in the test data, you put it on the street corner in the situation it's at now, and now after you've put in trillions of gigabytes of data and pruning and mapping, now the thing's going to go make a decision. It's free will. Okay, yeah, it freely decided, but its decision will be 100% based on the mappings that it's being given already. It had no control on its learning.
That's what I wanted to get into, because I had the thought that what if inputs, so you had said something about inputs and outputs of black box, right? You remember that?
Yeah. Same thing with the neural network. The neural network.
What if within that box, it's not just one? Let's say that you have one input to 3 outputs, and you only get one of the 3, but there's no way of telling which one of the 3. It's not determined by anything in the mathematics. It's going to be one of those 3, but that's the determination. It will be one of these 3 outputs randomly, arbitrarily, or whatever the word is that we should use.
Yeah, well, that's the question.
Well, let's say there's a. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, what word do you use? Because of the 3 options, the one that's going to be selected is going to be because the neural network was weighted towards that one. It had a predisposition.
Okay, so you run it over you run it 1,000 times. There's no kind of pattern in the distribution, but somehow they all end up being 30% each.
If the neural network was weighted 30%, each, then that would be, so even the distribution of choice would be a function of the test data and how it pruned the neural network. And that's really what it is, right? Because no one's perfect. Like you might make one decision 99% of the time, and 1% of the time you might do something totally weird for whatever reason. Maybe you didn't get enough sleep, or you had substances like alcohol or mushrooms or something, or whatever changes your neural network to a sort of a low probability behavior. But again, you're just changing a few inputs. Just messing with the dials a bit. Like there's nothing inside you that's intrinsically so sovereign that you can say, I produced this on my own with no background input. That's just never the case. So that's why I can't understand the argument. The concept of free will itself, it just seems to fail fundamentally at like the first step, because you would have to show a sovereign choice. And no one has sovereign choices.
Your belief in God, it is not it is a condition. It is an affliction, let's say, right? My atheism is an affliction. It's something that I'm stuck with. I can't do anything about it. And I mean, I agree to that, right? Like I don't believe that we can choose our beliefs, that we are convinced of them. We become convinced of them based on the evidence around us. Yeah,
and that's why Paul, for example, Paul's, he's the founder of the Christian church, and he fleshes things out quite a bit, especially philosophically. And he says, what does any man have that has not been given to him? He says, therefore, where is boasting? You cannot boast over another man, because in biblical Christianity, for you to boast that you are better than somebody else in any way is just ridiculous, because you weren't in control, and or even to feel too bad about who you are, that's also ridiculous, because you're fundamentally not in control. Not to say that you're not going to suffer the repercussions of it, but you basically can't take yourself too personally. You're not
okay. So here's what I want to ask you then.
You're not that powerful,
right? So you have been afflicted with Christianity. I have been afflicted with atheism. Let's say I am damned. Let's just assume that that's the case, right?
Yeah, whatever that means.
So that means I'm not going to get to be with God after I die. Okay. So why would you then say to me that God loves me?
Yeah, well, he doesn't, right? I mean, if that is the case, then he doesn't. Like, that's another strange Christian quip that's totally unbiblical. This concept that God loves everyone, like that is not in the Bible. I mean, I can read that chapter, Romans 9:11 again. It's like so succinct. It really explains. Should I read it? It's about 30 seconds.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Chapter 9, yeah.
So we did this last time too.
Chapter 9 is Romans. It just, I don't know anyone could argue this from the text that it means anything else than what it clearly means. It starts by saying, it's talking about, the chapter is called God's Sovereign Choice. And it starts the chapter saying, Rebecca had 2 children. And it says, before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose and election might stand, not by the works of men, but by the one who calls, the older will serve the younger. It is written, I said before Jacob I will love, and Esau I hated. And then, of course, the conversation diatribe starts. Then what shall we say? Is God unjust? And it says, not at all. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I'll have compassion on whom I have compassion. It does not depend on human desire or effort, but on God's mercy alone. For scripture says, even Pharaoh, I raised up Pharaoh to display my power, that I might be proclaimed in front of my people. So he's admitting that even Pharaoh, the big bad guy in the Bible, that wouldn't let the Jews go, God made him an asshole so that he could show the Jews his power. Therefore, God has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, and he hardens whom he wants to harden. So even like disbelief is his work. Like he deliberately hardens people's hearts so that they can't see. And then it goes on to say, one of you will say to me, then how can God blame us, for who can resist his will? Like now given this explanation of who God is, like how could he blame us? And then God's answer is, who are you, human being, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make some things in my house for special purpose and some other things for common use? What if, choosing to show my wrath, make my power known, I bore with great patience the objects of common use destined for destruction, so that the objects of my mercy would understand what mercy is?
Right.
So for me, that's clear. God's basically saying, I've basically created the simulation so that the objects of my mercy have a reference point.
So these terms like morality and truth in that universe are totally arbitrary. They are 100% based on the whims of this non-dimensional creature.
Yeah, I mean, it's considering Romans 9's explanation of God, it does start to get a bit silly, splitting straws about who's moral and who's not moral, and who deserves. I mean,
there is no such thing, right?
Well, there is such thing, but it's just so far from your control that it's almost like it exists, but it's made too big a deal of, because you are not your own God. Like you are not sovereign. You don't wake up.
Not only am I not sovereign, I'm not in control whatsoever. Yeah. I have no control. I am totally the result of his creation.
Yeah, if you're like an Islamic child growing up in the Middle East in a place where they'll burn you for handing out Bibles, you're not going to hear the gospel. Is that your fault?
Absolutely not.
Obviously
right?
not. Yeah. So like, how can and this is the thing, is that this is what's so humbling about Christianity, is that you just cannot boast. There's just nothing you at the end of the day, you can't say you deserve anything. You can't say you better anyone. You can't look down on anyone, because that it would be completely opposite to what you're being taught in the scripture. The scripture is like, no, you are elected before you even born. You are going through a simulation just for a reference point, so you'll understand what I'm doing for you. It's just like a book. People always like, why is there so much suffering in life? If an author starts to write a good book, no one's going to read a book that doesn't have suffering in it. No one's going to read a book that doesn't have a nemesis. In fact, you can only explain the hero to the degree that you can make the nemesis as bad as possible. Like those are the best movies where the bad guy is really bad. Like those are the ones you walk out and you really feel like you felt something. And God is the narrator. This is simulation. The suffering is basically part of the referential explanation of reality he's trying to portray.
So do you say God is good? And if you do, what does that mean?
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
You don't know what that means. Okay, yeah, I don't either.
Someone says God is good. He's like, he is sovereign. He is completely sovereign. So He's not good.
What
or
about
bad.
just? What about just? What does that mean? Is God just? And if so, what does that mean?
Well, he's just. So justice would be basically that he doesn't contradict himself. So if he were to, that's one thing God cannot do. He cannot contradict for himself, because if someone is sovereign, contradicts himself, he ceases to be God, because he's now inconsistent. Like the very idea of him falls apart. So that's why, that's part of the Christian doctrine, is that he created the law and sin, not because he thought man could manage it or overcome it, for the very reason he knew we would fail. He wanted us to see ourselves failing, so we would
But why?
realize we're not God. Like what you're experiencing what you're experiencing in life right now is you're experiencing a download to give you a reference point of what you are and what he is. And this is the way.
Imagine, just 1 second. Imagine that you wrote a book, right? And in the book, the whole book is about you, the real you, Jean-Claude, talking to your character. Let's call him Billy, right? And the whole book is just about you trying to tell Billy that he's not real. He's not God. He's nothing. Like, would anybody read that book? Is that a good story?
Well, it's got a few more caveats than just that, right? Like your entire existence, love, community, science, the world, all of it's part of a story. You're learning something. It's not just, but fundamentally, in the backdrop of all these, these caveats, these things that you're learning in life, the big lesson is that you are not God. That is really the number one lesson. You are not God. Well, and that's what free will.
Yeah, obviously, right?
Free will is basically a claim to divinity, because you're saying that you can operate outside of the will of the prime mover, or outside of the deterministic causality of this universe, which is essentially saying the same thing.
So, it just seems like if that's the case, all of existence is just a cosmic masturbation. It's no different than you playing a video game for 28 hours straight just because you can. Is not, there's no such thing as justice or good in that scenario. What we understand is as free will is just the programming as it feels to us. We just feel this programming, and it's all just a big joke.
Well, your free will is basically you standing on top of a mountain of pre-programming and then giving your response to that pre-programming. That's that feeling of free will, but obviously operating on preset data, preset inputs, a whole bunch of influences in your life that you had no control over.
Yeah, he wants me to feel that way, right? I don't even feel that way. I don't feel anything. I don't exist in this model. This model says that I am just a figment, and so are you. And the only thing that is real is God. And there is no point to even what you said about him trying to make the point to us that we are not God. That's totally superfluous. It's not. It doesn't matter. We don't matter.
Where do you even exist? Because you exist on a timeline that expanded 14.8 billion years ago, whatever that even means. Where did it expand from? Where are we now? Like the idea that we're real. What is reality? I've yet to hear somebody define what reality is. Like
that which is.
It's information. I think, therefore I am. Sure, but where?
That I've seen when you're asking about reality, asking where is reality. It's the whole encompassing answer. Reality is that which is. It is self-referential. It's circular, but it's necessarily so, right? It's a brute fact.
Yeah, I suppose you could just define reality as the thing that is most relevant to you. I mean, the concept that it's real, I don't know what that means, to say that it's real.
Oh.
It's real because it's relative to you. Like, for example, somebody on the other side of the planet that you'll never meet, who lived 500 years before you, in a way they're less real because they have they're less contingent.
I mean, I don't feel the realness, but they existed. I can find their remains or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean,
how would you distinguish? Like, how would you distinguish? Say, for example, you were in. I mean, you got 5 senses, right? And they're pretty low resolution. Your eyes can see like a very narrow band of electromagnetic radiation. Your ears can hear a very narrow band of a pressure through the atmosphere. You got your touch, which is also super basic. Taste, smell, like this is like, these are your sensory inputs coming in, right? And they're like super limited. And then even when you start moving to telescopes and electro microscopy and or like looking at other wavelengths, then we immediately start seeing a bunch of stuff that we don't even understand. We like start seeing quantum behavior in things that have a wavelength less than I think it's Planck's constant. Less, below that wavelength, things start operating in a way that doesn't make any sense to us in a 3D realm. So like when somebody says to me like, "Yeah, we are in reality," I'm like I'm not saying it's a useless concept. I just doesn't mean a lot to me because like, what do you know? It's like, what do you know of reality?
It literally means everything to me.
Like your reality, like inside this head, there is a very relatively small neural network that's decaying at a rapid speed, that's badly pruned. It's only been pruned for 40 something years for me, in my case. I'm getting dumber every day already. I've already reached the peak of my prime neural network pruning. I've got these limited senses. I'm forgetting faster than I'm learning already at this point in my life. Like, what do I know about reality? Like, what can I say about reality? It's like,
I mean, certainly, I totally concede. We don't have the perception of the full spectrum of reality by any means. We know that because, like, for instance, radio waves, Bluetooth, et cetera, right? Ultraviolet and infrared light. We know that the light that we see is not all the light that there is. And that's what we can do with that is we can do extrapolations and give us some kind of a hint as to how to probe that further, and then maybe we end up with something like a Bluetooth device, right? And so, like, I can still observe that existence, that reality of Bluetooth waves or radio waves, I should say, right? I can experience that reality of them with not without my senses. I can still interact with that reality, and if there is a sense in which God is that way to reality, then there should be some way to interact with him as well. But I mean, it doesn't even matter in this context though, because we're really just about like in this conversation, it's really just about what does it even mean, right? Because from my perspective, if I were you, if I believed what you believed, I would think that this is a really screwed up situation. I would hate the God that I believed existed, and then I would rebel against him. I mean, it might seem silly, right? But I mean, if you can do that, then that's more freedom, you might say, than any other of these agents are exerting at the time, right? Why not exert freedom if it's all just meaningless anyways?
Oh, I was actually having a conversation with a friend of mine the other day. He's also an atheist, and he told me that this is one of the best explanations he had heard when I was explaining this to him. I was like, imagine there's a king coming to your village, right? And your village has been hostile towards him. Maybe even not. But he's coming, and this guy, he doesn't lose. When he gets there, he's going to win, right? And you got 2 choices. You can, but you also, you know something else about this king. You know that he is merciful to those who ask. So there you see his huge army and him coming along to your village. Should you close the gates and make a last stand? Or should you open the gates and appeal to his mercy? And obviously, the more rational position is to go out and appeal to his mercy. And it's not about whether you agree with him or and what does that even matter? I mean, again, if you're like only a 40-year-old male with a few decades of neurological pruning, and now you're going to try and question the ways of a being that's so powerful your mind could never even comprehend. I mean, to like have a hissy fit and get upset about the vast chasm between you and him, it's kind of pointless, right? So why not just open the gates and go to him and say, I choose mercy?
I mean, it could be pointless, but I mean, the goal of that situation for me would be to get the king to realize that he doesn't get to decide what is good and bad and what is right and wrong, and he doesn't get to control everything about our lives, right?
Does.
I mean, from our history as human beings in our relationship with the monarchs and whatever, we've seen that the authority to have the sovereign authority is an immoral thing to a certain degree, right? Like it is not it breeds this kind of drunk with power kind of situation that, I mean, humans, but I mean, in the God of the Bible is especially susceptible to it, especially when you consider that this God doesn't have a father. He doesn't have a family to any kind of social structure to a backdrop to say, oh, I understand the right and wrong of my reality, therefore I'm apply this to my simulations. No, this is a solitude of eternity for a brat.
Well, yeah, I think this is the number one mistake, and I used to do this as well, is you anthropomorphize God, which you shouldn't do. Like in the same way as an ant can't look, you understand the business of God as much as an ant understands the business of lawnmower day, Like the chasm between your mind and his mind is so vast that to anthropomorphize him, to basically project what would be moral for humans to do on him, is like nonsensical. You wouldn't do that between an ant and a human. You wouldn't do that for things on this earth. Like an ant, if an ant decides to have lawnmower day and cut the grass, and it's gonna.
I mean, certainly their priorities are different, but I mean, just like us, these ants, they have a basic instinct structured like ours. They want to eat, they want to sleep, they want to,
Yeah, but I mean, you don't. I mean, like when you whip out your lawnmower, you don't. I mean, whether the ants are upset.
We mow our lawn so we can have sex. We do all those things so we can have sex. Everything that we do is so we can have sex, so we can make babies, have sex. Or I mean, some of us care more about the sex than the babies. Some of us care more about the babies than the sex. But we all just want to reproduce.
Sure, from a human perspective. But I'm just bringing up the example of the ant and the human on lawnmower day to say that the ant has no clue what's happening when lawnmower day starts, and he can get upset about it as he wants, but like it's kind of inconsequential. Like it's lawnmower day,
right? The
dude's gonna mow the lawn. What the ant thinks about it really doesn't matter, and I think that's a big mistake humans make, is that we kind of, again, it's kind of almost in the same vein of the arrogance of free will. Like, not only am I sovereign in choice, I can also tell the prime mover of the universe the way I think things should be. Like, that's one hell of a claim. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, that's the thing. If we accept that that's the case, then there is no such thing as right and wrong. So why not? Might as well. I mean, he's obviously programmed you to do that. I mean, God has obviously ordained since past eternity that I should sit here and say God is a brat. For some reason, he wanted to hear me say that. I don't know why, but I'm saying it. So
yeah, yes, yeah, it's 100% true.
Why not? Why not just rebel? I mean, you might as well. I mean, maybe he wants you to. I mean, obviously he wants me to because I'm doing it, right?
And that is what most people will do. I suppose in the Christian doctrine, unlike Judaism, Christian doctrine does state that Christians should try to open the door for others to advertise, to proselytize, So, in my proselytizing, I would say, in the backdrop of all this sort of deterministic kind of hard fact thinking, not in the sort of airy-fairy Christianity of, God loves you and, anthropomorphizing God and making him sound, I would just say there is a king coming, and he is sovereign, and you're not. And you can accept his mercy, or you can reject it. And why wouldn't you not accept his mercy? It would be an irrational response.
Well, have you ever seen Braveheart?
Yeah, but again, anthropomorphizing, right? It's humans versus humans. I think it's like the number one mistake people make is you have to wrap your head around the fact that God is not a human. You can't project your human fundamentals onto him. That would be it would be completely inappropriate to do that.
So how does that work exactly?
Every volcano,
like, obviously, a volcano is not a human being, right? But if a volcano spews ash on your head, you're going to be pissed off about it.
Yeah, but I'm just following with the sort of like the hard truths of God. Like every child that dies of bone cancer, every volcano that goes off, every tsunami that drowns children in their beds while they're sleeping at night. This is God. He's not going to make excuses for it. That's what a lot of religions do. They try to make it sound like God's running around trying to sort out this chaos, and he didn't really want this to happen. I mean, there is the concept of original sin and the fall, but again, it's pre-planned. So, the bottom line is God is sovereign. He makes no excuses for the way things are going to go. All you need to know is that there is an option to receive his mercy. And the way he decided to do that in his book, in his narrative, is he created a human which was a part of him since eternity began, that was born, called Jesus Christ. And that human is the hero of his story. And the backdrop of everything which he orchestrated, the nemesis which he orchestrated, is simply to give the hero credence, to create a reference point. Because again, you can't tell a good story without a nemesis. And that's why Jesus had to come into a world that is a world of suffering and challenges and difficulties. Otherwise, the story would have no meaning. If you came into a place that was perfect.
It's like you're saying God wrote a story to explain something. It's like if you wrote a story about Spider-Man to explain something to Spider-Man.
I mean, if Spider-Man didn't understand who he was, I mean, look, good example. At the end of a Spider-Man movie, and after Spider-Man's going through his narrative, his trials, the love and the sadness and the wins and the losses, he learns something about himself, and he gets to the end of the movie, and he has, a good story, good writing will work in the end that he learns something about himself, and that is what this narrative is. You're learning something about yourself.
Well, yeah, when you write a story, we write it. Somebody learns something. There's some kind of change that happens, and the purpose of that is to get the audience to relate to it, so that your peers can read your story and feel what you feel. So
and often
there must be some peer that God is showing this to for this to make sense. God has to have some kind of colleague, some other gods out there in order for this story to make sense.
For you were made in the image of God. You are witnessing your own story. You are experiencing the narrative of your own story. God is explaining who you are through your life. Otherwise, how else would he do it?
Well, I don't know, but I'm going to ask you also, because it was going to pop out of my head. If it's wrong to anthropomorphize God in the way that I seem to be doing in this conversation,
everyone does that. I would say Christians are probably more guilty of it, actually.
But is it not also an anthropomorphization when we talk about God in terms of mercy, in terms of intelligence, in terms of choices and creation and all these other things? Are we not also anthropomorphizing him? Like, what if we call him, right? Like, what if this first mover has, because I believe that if it's not an eternity all the way down, then there must be some kind of first thing, whatever that may be, but it doesn't have to be sentient. It doesn't have to have choices or feelings or whatever. It doesn't have to love me, that's for sure. It can just be a thing, like a random quantum fluctuation. It could be the first prime mover for all I care. So why is it not also anthropomorphization?
What, to say that God has mercy, has these sort of human characteristics.
Yeah, all the ways that you describe them.
Well, we are made in the image of the God, and we do understand rational thinking, and he is rational as well. So it's not like we completely across from each other. There is some common ground where we can understand some of the concepts, and that is one of the main purposes of Christ, right? One of the main purposes of Jesus is that he is the human interface to us. So if you look at all the other descriptions in the Bible of God, it says he is outside of space and time. It says that nobody can comprehend his mind. It says nobody has seen God. It says nobody has heard God, right? So this God is just fundamentally out of your league, right? But he has extensions of himself, like Jesus, which are understandable and are comprehensible. So in those instances, you can anthropomorphize him because he has put out an extension that can be anthropomorphized. So the source of God, the Father, lives beyond all comprehension. It would be silly to try and put human stereotypes onto him. But you can do that for Christ, Jesus, because he is human. And that is one of the fundamentally significant things about Christian theology, is it does both. You've got this God that lives outside of space and time, who answers to no one. He essentially only loves his son, this this actual human that he brought forth, and all those he's given his son to show mercy to. And the whole backdrop of life that you're living through is basically just to set the stage for that transaction, to give it meaning.
Yeah, I still don't see the meaning. It seems totally vacuous.
Yeah. So if you want to find anthropomorphic meaning in God, you have to look to Christ. But then when you look to the Father, the source of God, now you're out of your league. Like, if anything you say now is inappropriate to project onto him.
So it's what means something to him, really.
So Jesus is a human, right? He was in very essence God, right? So he would not sin. He wouldn't hurt anyone. He didn't kill anybody. He never lied. He followed all the commandments. So in that case, in the case of Christ, yeah, then you can hold him to a human standard because he's a human. But you can't use a human standard to judge the prime mover of the universe. That's just, it's just so silly in so many ways. Like, why would you want to use that metric for the prime mover of the universe? He's just so far beyond your comprehension.
I'm not trying to use a human metric. I mean, I am a human, so I can't think outside of my own mental capacity. I can't think as a god or anything like that. Like, that's not possible. But I can try to empathize and project in all those things that we always do when we're talking about other experiences, to try to understand them. And that's the best anybody can do. So if I can't do that, I'm curious as to how somebody can then, if that's all true, I'm curious as to how somebody can then say, well, then I understand, or I believe in this God idea. If I can't, if you can't say that a person has the ability to judge, then how can you say it's good? I say it's bad, but if I can't say it's bad, how can you say it's good?
Well, again, you need to make a distinction between the Son of God and God. So all these sort of questions about morality, you can ask them from your human scope of Jesus. If Jesus were to make a volcano explode and kill everybody, he would have sinned. If Jesus were to go on a raid and start murdering people, or curse somebody to death, if he had done that, he would have sinned, right? He would have sinned as God, because
no, he wouldn't have, right? Not by your model.
Well, he would have, because he would have disobeyed God. Sin is basically just disobedience. That's literally what sin is.
Disobedience, right? But if God had told him to do it, then it would be fine, right?
Yeah, but he wouldn't, because God's mandate to man, made very clear from the beginning, is that thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not lie. It's like, these are the things I expect from you.
Unless I tell you to.
the only time you can find exceptions for example, thou shalt not kill, the Ten Commandments are written by Moses, for example, right? And some of the punishments for breaking the Ten Commandments are that you will be killed, right? So you're like, oh, what a contradiction.
Sure.
But it's not really a contradiction. It's that you and your
But they do
capacity,
go on to kill people afterwards.
Yeah, but you and
Lots
your
of
personal
people.
you and your personal capacity have no right to go and kill another man. But on a national level, in terms of national security or a war, that's a totally different topic. But you as an individual have no right to go and kill your neighbor or steal from your neighbor. When it comes to a national level or geopolitically, that's a totally different.
Well, let's explore that for a moment, right? The idea that it's totally different. So,
Yeah.
I have some experience in this idea, this realm. I would agree that it is different. Yes, it is a difference in scope, a difference in ramifications and considerations. There are differences, but ultimately, I think that the same ruler, just like you can use the metric system to measure any physical object, but you can't use a tiny ruler to measure something that's like a house, right? So obviously you'll need a bigger stick to measure it. So yeah, you need a different stick to measure war versus the murder that one person commits, but it's the same metrics, the same system, the same units can be used to understand it.
And there are, and of course the Bible has a lot of laws of war as well, which are a separate group of laws. There's the Ten Commandments, which is kind of for the individual, and then there's the laws of war. For example, like you won't plunder people, you can't rape the woman. There's a whole bunch of laws for what happens after you've won the battle. They're like moral.
But
laws.
all those rules were broken by the Israelites.
Yeah, but they weren't commanded to do it. They were never commanded to go rape.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm under the impression that Moses was the military leader and that he had a direct line to God, and that he was the only time that God says that he said anything that he didn't tell him to say is when he struck the rock and said, "Hey, rock, give us water." But other than that, God has co-signed everything else that Moses has said. And as far as I understand it, that Moses was the military leader, so it seems to be reasonable that God told them to do those things.
Yeah, maybe not Moses. Moses died before they had any military conquest. Because remember that Moses kind of led them out of Egypt, and when they crossed the Sinai and crossed the Red Sea, and then wandered through the.
Well, he died right before they actually went into Canaan and took their promised land.
Yeah, exactly. So
but they had lots of conquests in between because they had gotten to Canaan at first, and then they sent in the spies. The spies said, "Oh, we can't win." So he's like, "Okay, well then let's you guys are wicked. Let's go back to the desert."
Yeah, but there was nothing compared to after Moses died. It was what's his name? I think it was
Joshua.
Joshua, your Bible well. Joshua was definitely the military commander. Moses is more kind of the guy who got them out of Egypt, and then Joshua.
Yeah, he got them out of Egypt.
Yeah, and then of course
they attacked the Amalekites. They attacked a couple other tribes in between their actual entrance into Canaan because they had to win a couple smaller battles to gain the numbers. They had to take slaves, recruit soldiers, and get supplies from smaller little villages before they could take the big prize, which was the land of Canaan. Now he used the excuse that they were wicked and scared, and that's why they had to go to the desert for 40 years. But
maybe who knows. But I know. I mean, for the stories of Joshua, mostly, like you said, small numbers of soldiers taking on much larger numbers, and they did it by scare tactics. They would like run into the camps at night and bang pots and pans and just cause chaos, and then start fighting. But it would be like pitch black, and people just woken up, so they'd start fighting with each other while the army was fighting with them, and they would use all these weird tactics to try and take out the enemy that was much bigger than them. But back to the point of military law, there were strict laws, like God would say, no, you will not keep anything of theirs, or you will not take any wives from this village, or he.
It's weird, right? There's times when he didn't do that, and times where he didn't. Sometimes he said, take whatever you want. Sometimes he said, take absolutely nothing. If you take even one single little thing, I'm going to curse you. And then there's other times he says, take the women, take the children.
So you can definitely make the claim that God's moral law for geopolitical conflict is far more vague than personal moral law. Because, like you said, sometimes he was like, I don't want you to touch anything. Just leave. Other times he was like, take everything. And that was just his commandment. There didn't seem to be any sort of consistent morality to it. It was just like what he told him to do. The only time you can find a sort of a more consistent moral code is on the individual level.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to push back on that right now. So I think that in terms of war and ethics, the Bible is very vague, like you just said, and I guess I'm
and then especially when you get to the New Testament seems to teach that Christians should avoid war at pretty much all costs. A lot of Christian sects won't even join the military. They won't even be part of a engineering program that is linked in any way to building weapons. I don't know where I stand on that. I mean, war is a fact of life. There are bad guys, and sometimes you need to fight them. I'll admit that it is vague. The moral law for geopolitical national conflict is very vague biblically.
Yeah, definitely. Let me ask you, before I ask you this question, I want to give you a chance to bring up any topics that you want to bring up. I don't know if you had any thing that was in the chamber that you wanted to discuss with me specifically. So I'm going to give you that opportunity in a second. But what I wanted to mention really quick, guys, is that I have a live show scheduled for every Sunday coming up next month, and I'm very happy to announce that on the 20th, I will have Dr. William Ratcliffe, who is a co-author of one of the papers that I have touted on Facebook about multicellularity, and I'm going to have him on the show. We're going to discuss the origin of multicellularity and his experiments that he's done in the lab in demonstrating how that actually came about in nature. So I really hope that you guys will like, subscribe, and join me for that discussion when it happens. Jean-Claude, please, if you have any conversation points that you'd like to discuss, I'd like to jump into those now.
Yeah, well, your next guest, that's a very interesting topic as well. Like the reverse entropy and initial replicators. The biology of what's needed for evolution to start. Another fascinating mathematical. I'm sure the next guy will be far more knowledgeable about it, but I've read that you need massive combinations of proteins just to get something that will possibly reverse entropy, because you initially need a replicator before you can have evolutionary progression. You need something that can replicate itself with a high fidelity, but mutate at the same time slightly.
We won't be getting into abiogenesis probably, because his work is not centered on that. He did an experiment where they introduced a single-celled algae and a single-celled fungi that was predatory, and the population mutated into multicellular algae because of the presence of that predator. And he's gone on to do a lot more papers in that regard, so we're going to talk about the new ones. But it's basically just about how a single cell goes from that to multicellular, because that's one of the hang-up points that creationists have. I don't think that you are a creationist. Are you?
No.
Young Earth? No. So
that's a very small sect of American evangelicals. Yeah.
Definitely. But they are there.
I think they account for like 2 or 3% of the Christians in the world, but they have a very loud mouth.
Yeah, and I think I even had a conversation with my father at one point where I asked him, like, if I could show you the proof that a single-celled organism can become multicellular, will you accept evolution as a plausible explanation for the diversity of life? And he said, yeah, so now we're doing this.
Yeah, I never had a problem with that. It was the abiogenesis, which I thought was very weak. The concept that you could just get a random protein chain to suddenly start replicating with a high fidelity and a mutation rate. Like that, for me, statistically didn't add up. The idea that just with the right conditions and lightning zapping some primordial fluid, you'd be able to randomly get those protein chains to appear and be stable enough to replicate. The math I looked at, it didn't make sense. But maybe
does it have to have the high fidelity right off the bat? Couldn't it develop the high fidelity shortly thereafter?
Well, that's the problem. The moment you say anything like develop later, you're already talking some sort of proto-evolution. For I mean, that's one thing I do understand as a computer programmer, as a computer scientist, that for a genetic algorithm, you have to have a functioning replicator, well-functioning replicator off the bat. That part can't develop because it doesn't know whether it's moving forward or back. There's no feedback loop yet. That's sort of a thing. That's sort of like a jump you need to get to before you can even have a fitness score. You know, a fitness score is basically the reward for surviving or breeding or replicating. You have to have that replicator first. And I have not heard a good argument on how a replicator just came to be. I mean, for me, it's not a hill to die on. Like if somebody showed me this is how a replicator can form from inanimate objects just by higher opportunity, I'd be like, okay, that's cool. So it's not like a fundamentally, is there a God or not question. But the science of abiogenesis, I find very, very weak mathematically.
I mean, it's definitely not to the point. It's nothing like evolutionary science at all. It's definitely
it's totally different. Yeah, and I only realized recently that even macro and micro evolution are completely different things. That's also something to look into. You know, macro evolution's got a whole bunch of other stuff baked into it that I don't understand. It's like super complicated. Like I understand microevolution as a computer scientist. I understand a genetic algorithm, but as you get more complex, you get these weird other statistical traits that emerge, and that's kind of above my pay grade.
So for me, when I heard about the Miller-Urey experiments from the 60s, I believe, to me that seems to indicate a rock solid line of logic from some kind of chemical evolutionary selection process in some kind of stable, quote unquote, primordial whatever. And from there, we know that couldn't produce amino acids. We know that amino acids are basis of DNA. So if that can happen from the basic chemicals to the amino acids, why can't it happen from the amino acids to the DNA? So, I mean, it just seems like a rock solid inferential line of logic that I don't see any kind of real refutation for, to say that abiogenesis is unreasonable. It seems totally plausible and probable, in my opinion.
For me, it's more like, okay, look, here's a complex Lego structure that someone's built out of Lego. And like, hey, look, here's some Lego blocks. And look, the Lego blocks can fit together. Problem solved. It's like, well, no, there's a whole bunch of steps before that. In fact, this Lego model is not just a Lego model, it's a Lego model that can replicate itself. You know? So just saying you've identified the building blocks and how some of the subcomponents might be able to create amino acids and maybe even some longer chain proteins. To get from that to the protein chains you'd need to build a functioning replicator, like mathematically. I mean, that, at the end of the day, it's an argument of statistics. Can this happen based on opportunity? That's really the question for that debate. Can someone prove the opportunity necessary for protein chains that complex to materialize accidentally?
Or, well, I mean, can you prove the opportunity? Can we prove that there was some kind of incubator of chemicals with the proper compositions and energy input to make that happen? Yeah. I mean, well, that's I don't think that you can prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt, but I think that it's beyond the pale of reasonable to infer that it was. Just because, I mean,
yeah, it's a nice sort of, you've got point A and you've got point Z, so obviously you know that something follows in between. And that's why spermidia is such a powerful hypothesis at the moment, because based on the amount of primordial fluid that would exist on Earth in its whatever billion years, you know, in the little pools of primordial fluid, it mathematically is impossible for the amount of fluid we had here to create protein chains accidentally that did that. But if you take into consider all the planets in the universe, now mathematically maybe it makes sense. And that's why spermidia, the idea that life actually got here on a rock as bacteria from another planet, because now you've taken the statistical opportunity from one planet to, geez, as far as a rock can travel in 4 billion years, which is
I mean,
hard. That makes more sense.
And even the Earth itself is just formed from other rocks, right? Coalescing under its own gravitational pull.
Yeah, well, those rocks would have come later because anything would have been incinerated during the initial coalesce. But yeah, that's an interesting.
You never know what kind of extremophiles can exist in space. Yeah. They may have some kind of capsid that allows them to survive even, the explosion of a star. Who knows?
Maybe. I know they found water on Mars now, like underground lakes. So it'll be fascinating to see what. Unfortunately, they're like 9 kilometers below the surface, so it's gonna be a while before we get to it. But I mean, that would be amazing. Imagine if we find like an entire ecosystem.
What will that do to your perspective on faith and the Bible specifically?
It's not an issue for me at all. I mean, so what? There's life somewhere else. I mean, what? The Bible is a book about Israel and God's covenant with man. It's not Israel. It's not a book, in Israel and through Christ with the Gentiles as well. But it's not a book about. It doesn't claim to be a book about everything else. It speaks to what it speaks to. It doesn't speak about what was happening in Asia around the same time. It doesn't care. It's got a scope. The Bible is about Israel. And then it's about.
I agree to a point, but it's really just all about in the first few verses of Genesis is what I'm focused on. From my counterpoint to that is just that the scope, it starts very wide and then quickly narrows to that point where you're talking about. But at the beginning of the book, it does have that cosmic scope that should have, I think, some information about the other possible.
The book of Job, he says, and God drew out the heavens like a curtain, which I thought was quite profound, because that's exactly how you would explain it. It's not like he made it; he drew it out and suspended the circle of the earth upon nothing. There's a couple of verses talking cosmic, but then all the narratives are about humans and man. Who knows what God might be up to on another planet? Light years away from here. That's just not our business, right? Like,
well, is it?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It could be one day. Maybe that is a part of the. Maybe a lot of things we read about the second coming and Christ returning. Maybe it's technological. What are spirits and angels but aliens? They're extraterrestrial beings, right?
Well, in the strict sense of the word, yeah.
Yeah, they're beings that don't live here.
So,
from a different space-time.
Let me bring up this chat that I saw a little earlier from Mademoiselle, just to see what you have to say about it. What is Leviticus 25:44-46 about anyways? They also go on to say, if God knows everything someone would do before they were born, could they do otherwise?
We'll have to bring up the Leviticus verse. I can't remember it off.
Let's do that. Let me pull it up real quick. I'll read it because Leviticus.
Well, you speak to the second point.
44.
No, you can't change. Your life is ordained. It is 100% ordained. And if you're going to have a come around in your life, say for example things aren't going well in your life and you're making a lot of bad choices, and you pray to God and He gives you a new mind to live a different way, and things improve, it's not like that caught God by surprise. It's not like you changed your destiny. It was baked into the cake before you were born that you were going to appeal to mercy to Him that day. Like, it was ordained that you would change. It's not like you changed His mind or changed destiny. That was your destiny to change.
Okay, so Leviticus 25:44-46 is the instructions for how to treat your slaves in the Bible. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you, and from them you may buy slaves. You may also buy slaves of the temporary residents living among you and members of the clans. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and you can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly.
Yes. Oh, the slavery talk. Nice. Slavery is interesting. So the first thing about slavery is to understand that when they say slave in the Bible, they're not talking like African slave trade, which is like thousands of years later. They're talking about prisoners of war, and they're talking about indebted servants. So under the feudal system, which is the majority of mankind's scope of economy, you didn't have governments and taxes and monetary policy and shared paper and banking credit. You didn't have any of these things. You had feudal lords that controlled the land. So you essentially lived in microstates, right? So if you live in a microstate and the richest guy on the hill who controls the vast majority of the resources, if you owe him money and you go bankrupt when you can't pay him back, you have to work it off as an indebted servant. Now this is the majority of slaves in the Bible. The other type of slave are prisoners of war or criminals, right? Now we always go, slavery is so terrible. It's like, okay, but in the US right now, 2% of your population is locked behind steel bars and forced to work for free. It's called prison, right? It's exactly the same thing. If you conquer another nation, right, and what do you do once you've conquered that place? Do you murder everybody, or do you bring them in to your society? And when you bring them in, what do? They don't own any land. They don't have an ID. They don't have any monetary connection. It's not like they can go onto LinkedIn and find a job. No, you join the feudal system. So if you want to understand slavery in the Bible, you just need to put yourself into a Bronze Age feudal system where rivaling tribes are like killing each other. You have prisoners of war, and then just to consider that the prison system today is exactly that. We do that to our own citizens. If you do something wrong that breaks the law of the government, no matter how ridiculous it is, they will have you sewing jeans together behind steel doors for free for as long as they want. So I don't see the difference between that and biblical slavery.
So
and then
you don't see any no, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so it's not ideal. I mean, this is one thing when you read stuff like Leviticus, it's not a prescription for what is ideal. It's a description of what is the reality of the feudal system. If you go into the New Testament, constantly the Christians are telling the slaves to try and get their freedom. There's no sense that they're saying this is a good thing and this should continue. It's basically playing the balls it lies. It's what if you're playing golf and the ball lands in the sandpit. Now you've got to decide how you're going to play the ball in the sandpit. There's no point in having a debate about why the ball should be in the sandpit or not. If you're in the feudal system, you're in the feudal system. How are you going to deal with it? It's the same thing with war. Nobody wants war. War is not ideal. We wish we didn't have war. But what happens in a war? What rules are we going to have now when a war starts? That's not to say that we're promoting war. It's just saying that we are considering what rules we could put in place in this unideal situation.
So you don't have any qualms about the slavery in the Bible at all? You think that it was fair and just?
Well, I have a very pragmatic view on it. I'm just saying what would have been based on the setting, what had just happened. So you've just conquered another village, right? Now you've got these women and children and some survivors. You have no government system like we have today. What is your best? This is a completely unideal situation, right? Half the men are dead. You got women and children. There's no one wants to feed them. Nobody in your nation sure as hell wants to feed the enemy's children and look after the enemy's women. Okay, so what do? There's nothing good you can do. So I have a very pragmatic view of it. If I always say to people, if you don't like a situation, give a better alternative. Because we're not talking about ideals here. In an ideal world, we have no slaves, we have no war, we have no prisoners. But that's not the world we live in. The question is, what is the better alternative given the situation we have?
So it's interesting. The idea that slavery still happens today in America as a part of the justice system is very true. For anybody that doesn't understand that, the law that actually outlawed slavery in America specifically says that it's unless you get convicted of a crime. So you are still totally allowed to be enslaved when you are sent to jail. So think about that the next time you want a law to be made by anything. I don't.
So the question is, what would be better than the U.S. prison system? I'm sure that there are way better things. Like if you could, what would be better than the U.S. prison system? If you got them to work fields in a feudal system. Then they could actually like have jobs, live outside, look after animals, be productive, live a high quality of life. But oh no, they're slaves, they're not being paid. It's the same
Well, I
thing.
mean,
It's like
like you said, in terms of warring ideologies, there's no perfect answer, right? But I would say
yeah.
the most moral thing that you can do as far as conquering another people, even if let's just assume that they are a bad people, whatever that means, and you have to conquer them.
Yeah.
The ideal would be that you only kill those that pick up arms against you in direct self-defense. The rest are imprisoned and then rehabilitated to the furthest extent possible.
Yeah, but this is again Bronze Age feudal system. It's not like you have councillors and a government and like a government spending for rehabilitation of prisoners of wars. I mean, we're talking like proper pre-Bronze Age. You go into the other village, you kill every single man, because if you don't, he's going to kill you. Teenage boys, you're going to kill them as well, because if they get hold of a sword, they're going to kill you. That's the way it is. You've got all these women and children. What do you do with them? I mean, I'll tell you something even more shocking. There are places in the Bible where God commands the army to finish off the women and children as well. And the reason for that is because there was nowhere for them to go. Because imagine, you've just lost all the men in your village, right? There's no protection. There's no food. There's no income. It's just you and whatever soldiers and mercenaries are roaming around. That's your future. Okay, that's just going to be rape and pillaging. And in that case, God was like, no, it would be better that you just execute them all. And they would just wipe out the entire village. Because the alternative was even worse, literally becoming sex slaves of mercenaries when the army rolled out.
But hold on, because they actually did the alternative. In other sections, they said, okay, go ahead, take the women, make them your wives.
Yeah. Well,
don't kill them and keep them.
Yeah.
And they could have multiple wives. I mean, why not?
Yeah, well, that was the reason. Logistically, it was pragmatic. They had young men. For like, say, one of the stories, they had a massive imbalance of women, and they had just gone to war, and a whole bunch of the men didn't have wives. And then they were like, okay, well, let's not kill the women. Let's take them as wives. But then another situation, the men had wives. Nobody wanted these women. They would have just starved in their burnt down village. And in that case, he was like, execute them. Now, these are harsh, terrible things. This is like wartime decisions. And again, I'm not saying I'm not saying it's not harsh. I'm not saying it's tragic. It's all of those things. But I'm just saying, give me a better alternative in a feudal Bronze Age setting after an all-out apocalyptic war. And
let's say I grant you totally. I'd say I grant you totally that there is no better alternative for that time and context, right? Wouldn't you then say that since this is all being authored by a timeless God who is supposedly speaking to all audiences throughout time, that he would also include the ideal version? Like, okay, I'm going to acknowledge that this is the reality. This is what you got to do because this is how it is for you Bronze Agers. But for the guys that are reading it in 21st century America and South Africa, this is how it's supposed to be. Why wouldn't they include that then?
I think if you read I read the Bible verbatim without any sort of manipulation from outside sources. And it never struck me once when I was reading Leviticus that this was a prescription for taking slaves. Like when I read it, if you read it in the full context of the chapter, it's like, this was a time in history in this tribe called the Levites, who were like a priest tribe. And they were dealing with a wartime situation where, like, literally, you would go out and like 2/3 of your men would die. It's like the other third are like bleeding and maimed. I mean, it was like completely horrific, right? And now these Levites, who are like the priests, they have to like come up with these rules for the people what to do in battle, right? So it's a small tribe of priests giving advice on what they think the soldiers should do pre and post battle based on certain conditions. So I understand it to be that. I don't understand it to be a prescription of, hey guys, slavery is cool, or go wipe out the village next door. Like, I don't think anybody who reads that with reasonable comprehension would take that home. The context is not that. The context is the Levitical priesthood giving advice to people in the heat of battle and after battle on what to do. It's not a prescription for my life or what's moral or what's immoral. It's like, It's more of a historical account than is a prescription for life. And I think that's people who cherry pick verses out of these historical accounts and make it sound like it's a prescription for a moral ethic. I don't think that's fair to the comprehension of the text. I certainly didn't read it that way.
Okay, I'm gonna let you have the last word on that. I'm gonna go ahead and bring up some questions that we have started real quick, and then we can wrap it up if you'd like.
Cool.
So here's something I start from Guitar Dog. They said Jesus came to the world because things were so bad, so much suffering. Then after he floated away, the world had much more death, war, suffering. Not good. Perhaps he should have tried another flood. So this little humor there. Yeah, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, and from Israel's perspective, it was worse than the flood, right? Because the disciples, remember the Jews, they always think the Messiah is going to come and recreate Israel. That's the Jews are constantly obsessed with this idea of an Israeli empire that's going to rule the world. And they misunderstand their own text. And when Jesus comes, they're like, hey, look at our amazing temple. Look how fantastic we are. And then Jesus tells his own disciples, he says, you see your amazing temple? Not one stone here will be upon itself by the end of this generation. And you will fall by the sword and be scattered to all the nations of the earth and be persecuted wherever you go until the times of the Gentiles are complete. So Jesus knows very well that them rejecting him as a nation is going to be the worst thing that ever happens to them. And exactly as he predicted, in his generation, the Romans come in, they smash the temple, they burn it, the gold pours between the cracks of the stones, the mercenaries afterwards trying to get the gold, take every stone apart, leaving nothing left of the Jewish temple. The Jews get scattered to all the nations of the world. And of course, exactly as he predicted. So yeah, Jesus didn't promise that things were going to get easier. He came to open the door to Gentiles and Jews, but also to judge Israel for rejecting him, and they were judged very severely.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, so here's one from Iron Charioteer. They say Yahweh and Jesus loves virgins for some reasons. So thank you for that comment. And then they also went on to say, question for the guest: why did God create war?
Why did God create war? I mean, why did God create any suffering? I would think that would come right back to the narrative of he is telling a story, and that story includes suffering, and that suffering includes war, it includes family disputes, heartbreak. I mean, all the terrible, tragic things. Includes bone cancer in children. It includes, there's a huge scope for suffering in this world, and it's part of the narrative. God did not spare us suffering. To speak to suffering, you're living in a temporary domain. Your life is a little blip on the radar. So the way to deal with suffering and to understand war in its full context is that this is a temporary thing. This is part of a fallen world we live in, and it's temporary. It doesn't eternally dictate who you are, even though in this present time there's a lot of suffering.
All right. Thank you so much. And then another question from Iron Charioteer. Last one here on the list. Yahweh and Jesus created calamity and evil. That's a Isaiah verse there.
Yes.
I guess further expounding on that same theme there.
Yeah, I think that's back to our determinism theme. And again in Romans 9, God makes no excuses. Everything that happens here happens by his sovereign will. But again, The big take home is that think of the Son of God, Jesus. You can anthropomorphize him. You can put your moral qualms onto Jesus, and you can see that he is perfectly moral. But you can't project those moral qualms onto God, because you cannot anthropomorphize the prime mover of your existence. The chasm between you and him is far too big for that to be an appropriate projection.
Got it. All right, so that's all the questions I have on the list. So I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up. If you have anything else you'd like to say, I want to before you do that, I want to just remind everybody that Jean-Claude is linked in the description below. Also, the video that from our last conversation, the audio wasn't great. I'm sorry about that, but it's not too bad. That's linked below also, and just reminding you all that I have upcoming videos, so please like and subscribe. And go ahead, Jean-Claude. Is there anything you'd like to say? You'd like to tell them what's going on in the channel, anything like that?
No, I haven't started a channel yet, but yeah, like I said, I just had my fourth child a year ago, so I'm a little
that's right.
deep. Yeah. But
Yeah,
I
it's
would
been a
love to
year
start
since that conversation.
I'd love to start a channel one day. I'll definitely call you and ask you how it's done. Because
Oh, okay. Well, just take
Yeah,
these
it's-
videos and put them on YouTube, and then you got a channel.
yeah, and congrats on what we were saying, 7 years of Atheist Edge.
Yeah, 7 years. So yeah, I'm gonna have a special thing coming up for the next year's anniversary, and from now on, all the anniversaries. But thanks to John Claude, gave me a great idea. So you guys look forward to that.
And massive respect to everybody who keeps channels like this going and critical thinking. It's a wonderful thing. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you coming and having this conversation with me. It was a very cordial conversation. I enjoyed it, and I can't wait for the next one.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Once again, everybody like and subscribe and comment if you'd like. Remember, it's the bridges we build, not the bridges we burn, that give us the edge. Y'all have a great night.